Welcome, everyone. I'm here with Tim Wentworth, CEO of Evernorth. Evernorth is a wholly owned subsidiary of Cigna Corporation and the parent company of the Express Scripts, Accredo, Evicare, and Evicare companies. Evernorth was created in fall of 2020 to accelerate Cigna's growing health services portfolio. And Tim, who had already been serving in a leadership position for Cigna, moved into that role. So welcome, Tim. Thank you for joining me.
Really, really good to be here with you, Stuart. Thank you.
Well, let me just start with a general question about leadership. Tim, you know that's what we're talking about in Defining Moments. We're grappling with the question of how do you develop the skills of effective leadership. So you have been in some pretty significant leadership positions in your career. So as you sort of look back on your career and the things that have worked and the things that haven't, what have you learned about the most essential qualities and competencies for effective leadership?
Well, it's obviously a big question, and one I've spent a lot of time thinking about and being really intentional about as I've gone through my career journey. And you know, there are a number of things that I think, if I think about it, I would pull sort of into the narrative. I think first of all, and it's pretty fundamental when you say this, but it's going beyond, so to speak. You know, I often talk about the circle of control versus the circle of influence. And so many people as leaders, or even before they become leaders, really, really focus on their circle of control and trying to expand their control, whether that's how many people report to them or how big a piece of the organization they directly are responsible for. And what I have learned and what I encourage other folks to really think about is your circle of influence, your true ability. You know, a lot of companies today call it enterprise thinking, but your ability to think more broadly, to impact things that maybe you don't directly control, is in many, many ways more important. In fact, you know, you could argue, I was the CEO of Express Scripts, a publicly traded Fortune 20 company. People ask me all the time, why on earth did you stay with Cigna and take a subordinate position to the CEO there? And there's two reasons. One, he's a great leader. And two is, while my circle of control in some respects appears smaller, my circle of influence is actually larger. I'm now impacting, you know, a Fortune 12, I think we're a Fortune 12 company, 165 billion in revenue, not 100 billion. Evernorth, you mentioned, we launched it this year. One of the rare opportunities anyone will ever have to launch a B2B brand, immediately a $125 billion revenue brand. And so the chance to do that, the chance to now develop leaders in the broader Cigna, all of that just adds up for me to focusing on the right thing, which is really the circle of influence. And I think that, again, the other thing I'd point to, and I think it's the other big piece to being a good leader, is communications. I have worked my entire career to refine my communications ability and to improve it and to think more and more about my audience. And I will tell you, this year in COVID, what I've learned about communications, showing that even at age 60 you can learn something, has been that the value of listening purely for the sake of listening, not to be formulating an answer while you're listening, has never been more important. And whether it was people who are going through personal circumstances that are challenging, whether it's people grappling with some of the social justice issues that suddenly came so much into fore, what I learned is folks didn't necessarily want an answer from me. They wanted to know I was listening. They wanted to know they were heard. They wanted the opportunity to formulate their thoughts with somebody else. And so communicating is a two-way process. We all know that. But I think sometimes that as particularly leaders, younger leaders, growing up leaders, we think about having exactly the perfect message. I've learned the way to have the perfect message is to make gosh darn sure you understand your audience really well. And again, as a leader in a business, wanting to make sure that we really deliver the right distinctive message to all the constituents that as a leader you have, nothing more important than really, really being purposeful, intentional, and skillful at communicating. So that's a couple of the things I would point to. Wow,
that's powerful, Tim. I love that insight about listening. And what a sort of counterintuitive in some way leadership skill. Mm-hmm. But let me follow up on something you just said there, Tim, that really caught my attention. You said something about enterprise level thinking as a critical skill. And that clearly is something that you've been able to do at Cigna, but how does somebody develop that skill? Is that a skill that just comes through experience, or do you have any suggestions for people that want to develop that skill?
Yeah, it's interesting. Actually, I'm helping lead a group of leaders through Cigna, about 25 leaders in a program that was developed by two of them. And the whole starting point was how do we as leaders, meaning they, help sponsor a program that helps some of their teams and some of their colleagues develop enterprise thinking. And it was a really interesting challenge to sort of dialogue with them through that, because you don't just take a class, you don't just have a formula or drink a drink or something and do it. What I would say is it starts with deeply trying to understand the broadly defined customers of a business, and the impact that every role in the company has on that customer. And if you can't answer that question, you really don't understand your business, first of all. But secondly, that begins to help you connect the dots across the parts of the enterprise that can come together in novel ways to actually serve a particular customer or a particular business need. And so it's about deeply knowing the industry you're in, the business you're in. You know, in the case of running Express Scripts, the example I had was it wasn't sufficient to know how pharmacy worked. You needed to know that our customers may have been in the broadly defined healthcare universe. And so anything having to do with healthcare might be relevant. You ought to try to deeply understand it, because then you could decide how to impact our corporation to be more relevant to that particular customer who's in that circumstance. But again, stepping back, it sometimes means as well realizing the thing that you were working on that felt so important may not be as important as something else that you've needed to pivot to in response to something in your environment or something that your customers have either demanded or need. And so that's the other piece. As I was growing up in my career, and particularly as I was mentoring folks sort of in the middle part of my career and the earlier parts of theirs, helping them understand that what they had committed to, what was in their objectives, could suddenly change. And some of the best leaders I know were the ones that were able to quickly change and then help their team understand the broader context of why that change was important. Back to communications, was really an important skill set, an important thing to sort of consciously manage, that many people are change avoidant, and want to sort of define very narrowly their circle of influence, or rather control, and protect that, rather than really try to understand, is it still the best thing we can do? I mean, we do this. I just got out of a call today. You know, we cast our 2021 capital budget of $1.2 billion. We are already asking the question, based on what we know today with a new administration in Washington, for example, did we invest that $1.2 billion as we think about what we were going to build with it the best way? Are there some things we may need to refund or more heavily fund or completely cancel? And we found things that we need to rethink, because the environment changes that quick now. And the good news is enterprise thinkers can pivot their thinking very rapidly to doing what's best for the enterprise. It also means you do need to know the math of the business. You know, I know that your program is very data rational, and it is not sufficient to be a cheerleader leader. You do have to understand your leverage points, your balance sheet, as well as your income statement, because especially I think COVID exposed balance sheets as being way more important than people understood. And I think it was Warren Buffett who said, when the tide goes out, you see who's swimming without trunks. And the balance sheet is your trunks in a lot of respects. And so, again, understanding what you doing, how that impacts cash flow, how it impacts EVA, how it impacts ROIC. And if you don't know, asking, that's enterprise thinking.
I love that. And so one takeaway from what you just said, Tim, for me is, okay, if you want to develop enterprise thinking, you don't necessarily focus on the enterprise, you focus on your customers and you know your business. And I like that. That makes a lot of sense. Well, so you mentioned our focus at Olin on data and preparing people who are competent with data. And I want to take just a minute and get your thoughts on something, because we spend a lot of time at Olin thinking about, as we're developing leaders, creating leaders who are both data driven and values based. We want sort of that combination of values and data. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on kind of that tension that sometimes leaders encounter between the following your head and following your heart. I don't know. Does that bring anything to mind for you?
Well, it does, and I'm biased in this way, and so that bias will come through, I think. Because the data is, there's always more data. There's always different ways to look at data. It's the old, in some respects, there's the old line that, statistics don't lie, but liars are really good at using statistics. And so I believe in trusting and following the data. I believe in letting the data lead me to a hypothesis. So the data can create a lot of variability, a lot of avenues of judgment, and a lot of optionality, and a lot of confidence or lack of confidence in that optionality and in those moves you may make or decisions you may undertake as a result of the data. So for me, the data is terribly important. But what's really, really important is getting really crystal clear on what your fundamental values are, because in the end, the value may well test, or the data may well test your values as it relates to the things in front of you. And I can tell you that in my career, there have been times that you don't balance the two. You don't look at that. I don't look at it as a two-dimensional, as a spectrum where I got my values here and something that I look at it as a 2x2 where I got to be high on my values and figure out what's the smartest thing to do given the data that I've got. Now, one of my values, or maybe it's not my value, my biases, is speed. And of course, there's that third dimension of speed besides your values in the data, which is more data is always available. The question is, at what point do you have enough? But for me, the values piece of that is the part that people are gonna judge you by. It's how they're gonna predict what they need to do in order to be right. And then when there's tension between the two, it's not the values that change. It's the judgment that you've got to apply. And I tell folks all the time, I don't live in a black and white world. I wish I did. Leaders, once you get to a certain level in an organization, are living almost constantly in a gray world where judgment is what really, really matters. And for me, the only way you can wade into every day going in knowing that your judgment's going to be tested, that you're not going to be sure in the moment that you're correct, isn't going to be the data. It is going to be having a rock solid set of values and being able to communicate those as a leader to others so they understand you, and to understand in the culture of your organization what the role of values and what the values are. And I remember I quit a job back in the late 1980s. I had been hired by a wonderful company, a company everyone would know. And I was very, very successful there. I had left PepsiCo to go there. And I left after 21 months. And what I told the CEO when I left, and we retained a long relationship afterwards, was I loved the stated values of the company. What I couldn't live with was the actual values that they were practiced by the leaders, which were very different than the stated values. And so for me, that was an early lesson in, how important my values were to me, that I just couldn't perform and they were a highly data rational company. They were in the property and casualty insurance business, and a very clever company, one of the probably cleverest companies in the country at the time. And needless to say, again, for me, I realized then at age 28, that I couldn't perform my best in an organization whose values didn't align with mine. Once I found a place where they did, then yeah, you attack the data. You get as much as you can and you make your decisions, but you do it with the confidence that your leaders will support you and that you as a leader will support your team based on being able to, where there is judgment required, rely on your values. And again, I could point to a number of cases. I had to terminate somebody who had amazing performance metrics. Amazing performance metrics, a long history. All the data on this guy was, you don't want him to leave. You don't want him to go to your competitor. He's going to outperform everybody around him. But he was also sexting a colleague, and early in the texting days. And there was, a question of, do you give him a warning? My answer was no, you don't give him a warning. You now know clearly where his values lie, and they don't match yours. And despite all the data to the contrary in terms of his performance, his values didn't fit, and he had to go.
Wow, that's great, Tim. I love those experiences you shared are just spot on. And in fact, those experiences you shared really kind of raise the next point. In a few minutes, we'll be speaking to our students in defining moments, and it's really what we're trying to do in that class, as you know, because you've spoken in that class before, is just invite prominent leaders like you to reflect on those moments that we're defining and helping them to articulate their values and their philosophy as leaders. So I'd love to ask you about a few of those. In fact, I'd love, if you're open, there's a story that stuck in my mind from last time. I think it was when you were at PepsiCo. I also worked at PepsiCo back early in my career in organization and management development. But I think you shared a story about a negative performance evaluation and how that became defining for you. I wonder if you'd be willing to share that for us here.
Sure. It's always easier to share a story about a negative performance evaluation when your career is kind of worked out okay. But I will tell you, I've used that lesson so much in my career as a leader. I was 25 years old. I had joined PepsiCo from the music business, so a very different business. I was in a field HR role where I'd been in a headquarters role, and so I'm now out in Dallas, Texas, and Fort Worth, Texas, as the HR rep for the guys, and it was all guys that were getting in the trucks at 6 a.m. and slugging very heavy cases of Pepsi in the hot Texas heat. And so that was my role. Very, very different, very, very visceral role. We had union challenges and so forth. And I came out of a headquarters New York City music business environment. And so I was struggling to find my way, but I thought I was doing okay. I was building relationships, which I'm pretty good at. But I was not getting things done. And I was probably in denial about it, if I'm honest, maybe even a little afraid and hoping nobody would notice, so that my stuff I was getting done was going to more than compensate for it. In that context, my boss and his boss, Mark Esselman and John O'Loughlin, I remember them like it was yesterday, and they deserve to be named because they're heroes in my life. They wanted me to go to lunch, and I thought, well, this is great. Finally, a business lunch. I used to have those in New York all the time. Now I'm out here in the hot Texas sun, running around with the route salesman. Sit down with him, and Mark pulls out an envelope with a piece of paper in it and tells me basically I'm on a 90-day performance plan. Otherwise, I'm going to be asked to leave the company. That I was not getting some things done, some training manuals for the drivers and some other things that we had discussed my achieving. Now we can debate whether or not they documented some of that up front as well as it should be, but it's irrelevant. I was not performing and I knew it. And what I today am deeply grateful for, as I was then, was they were serious about that. I had a challenge with my performance. It was my responsibility to think about, was I committed to doing something about it and what help did I need? But it was my responsibility. I couldn't delegate this to them. And they had the integrity to then, over the next 90 days, give me the space, the coaching, and the support to turn it around, to the extent that 6 months later, I was promoted to manager and sent to San Antonio. And a year after that, I was promoted to senior manager and sent to one of the troubled spots by the CEO of the entire corporation. And I can tell you that from my standpoint, I'm very biased, therefore, to coaching, to feedback that's honest, which sometimes is hard, right? But when I think about even the golden rule says, in that circumstance, would Tim Wentworth rather have had a nice business lunch and got fired 90 days later? Or would Tim Wentworth rather have had a conversation that was extraordinarily uncomfortable for me and maybe for them, that gave me a chance to actually be a constructive member of the team? The answer is B. That's pretty obvious, I know. But I can tell you, sometimes as leaders, you think, oh, maybe he'll get it, or maybe she'll get it, or oh, it's going to really, really be a tough conversation and I'm just not ready for it. And I can tell you, if you're thinking it, you're probably already late. And I think that most of the time the person knows it and they need to hear it, and you can get the clock going. And so for me, I think it's just a huge, huge piece for me. And today there's a lot I wrote down as I was thinking about some of the questions you were going to ask about coaching and mentoring and partnership and sponsorship. And that's all really important. And every one of your students should find people that can do those things, right? Mentors and sponsors, which are different, and coaches. But you know what? In the end, you own your performance. And one of the things I tell people, young people in particular, is in your first jobs, and frankly, in every job, really align with your boss and the organization about what the four corners of the job are so that you can go far past them. But if you don't have clarity around what those are, you may not even hit them. And for me, it's all about going far past them and exceeding the expectations of an organization. Is how you get noticed and how you get ahead. And in the long run, how you create enterprise value. And for me, again, really important to have those coaches and that support system, but equally important to have personal accountability. And that's what they shocked me with that day. And to this day, if someone comes to me and says, I've got a guy or a woman that I'm going to put on a 90-day plan, they get quite a grilling from me about their commitment to that person actually having a chance to succeed.
Well, thanks for sharing that, Tim, because I mean, yeah, obviously, usually we focus on all the great ones. And at the end of the day, I think that was a success story. But what was so powerful for the students last time you talked about that was that, hey, it didn't start well, and you turned it around. And I think that's great. What a great example. Okay, well, we're about out of time, so so the last thing I'd like to do, Tim, is I would love to hear from you. What's the most exciting thing going on at Evernorth right now?
Wow. Well, we have launched Evernorth, so just launching a new brand like that out into the marketplace, going out and declaring to the healthcare ecosystem. I mean, healthcare right now is one of the two largest issues in our country, I believe, along with education. We can put the economy there, but quite frankly, it's a function of those two things. And so for me, we've got a platform that's out there building and developing and delivering solutions to the broad ecosystem. Again, as I mentioned, we've got 125 billion in revenue in 21 that we're shooting for. And what's exciting is of that revenue, because we're owned by a health plan, and the theory about Evernorth is, oh, well, you're owned by Cigna, you're taking care of Cigna. 90+% of my revenue is outside our four walls. It's through partnering and working with others. And over the last year, what's been exciting is we have built cornerstone relationships already, beating out significant competition to win Prime Therapeutics twice, which is a 23 Blue Cross and Blue Shield owned plan that could have gone anywhere. In fact, the thought was they would go with one of our big competitors that happens to be a Blues plan. So we've won major, trusted, deep, big relationships early. Then at the end of the year, Amazon put their brand on our work. So when they launched their pharmacy program out into the marketplace, we are the guts inside it that are actually helping them execute that. They rarely, if ever, do that. And so what's exciting is here we are, $125 billion part of Cigna, growing part of Cigna, and importantly, still at the ground floor. I mean, and so when I get asked, why did you stick around in part, and I've been around 2+ years after the merger, it was because it was a ground floor opportunity in healthcare at scale to impact lives in a way that otherwise I couldn't do in a startup or something like that. And so for me, it's ground floor opportunity with scale, with the ability to work with really significant players in the ecosystem to reimagine what can happen. And healthcare needs it because the affordability crisis in our country and the access crisis in our country in terms of really great technology that we cannot afford today couldn't be a more interesting problem to work on. And so for me, I encourage every student I talk to really look hard at a healthcare career because that's where a lot of innovation is going to happen in the next 20 years because it has to.
Well, that's exciting. I think you're going to have a receptive audience among many of our students for that sort of excitement and opportunity for innovation and impact. Well, Tim, we're out of time, but let me just thank you so much for taking a little time to reflect with me here today and also to be with our students a little later on. We sure appreciate it.